I'm Courtney, 34. On paper, my life looked exactly like the part of the rom-com where things finally click into place. I'd found someone I actually wanted to share a Netflix password with. We'd booked a tiny backyard venue with string lights and tacos, and I'd spent the previous year building a career that let me breathe for the first time in my adult life. What was at stake that morning wasn't just a dress or a party. It was the one small, stubborn thing I'd always wanted from my family, proof that they saw me. When the ceremony started, there was an empty row where my parents should have been. Not a late traffic story or a "we were stuck" text. An absence that felt practiced, as if they had done this exact choreography before. My mom, Helen, and my dad, Greg, had RSVP'd, then vanished. My brother, Mason, the person our family orbit always bent around, never appeared either. The sight of those empty chairs made my cheeks hot. I remember squeezing my husband's hand so hard I could feel his pulse in my palm and trying to smile through a throat full of betrayal. I'd grown up used to being background scenery in our own house. Mason's temper tantrums were called spirited, his failed classes were learning experiences, and his broken promises were boys being boys. Meanwhile, whenever I asked for help, money for school, emotional backup during a terrible breakup, or even just someone to show up for a parent-teacher conference, I learned to be small. My parents had a talent for minimizing me, a kind of selective attention that always favored Mason like he was the sun, and I was someone they only remembered on cloudy days. So this wedding was my test. It was less about the legal part, I could sign forms, and more about whether the people who raised me would ever treat my milestones as more than footnotes in Mason's story. I had imagined my mom crying in the pew, my dad telling a bad joke to steady himself, Mason rolling his eyes and making us laugh during speeches. Instead, the door stayed closed and the house stayed silent, like someone had muted a channel of my life. People talk about betrayal as if it's a sudden knife. Mine was a slow, persistent eraser. The empty seats weren't an accident. They were the latest page in a book where my name was printed in pencil. That morning, under the lights and the taco stand's cheerful hum, what was at stake wasn't vindication or revenge. It was whether I would accept being invisible in my own story, or finally write myself in bold. After the wedding silence, I threw myself into the thing that never asked me to be smaller: work. I co-founded a startup, Lumenly, because I loved solving problems and because it gave me a vocabulary for results that my family never learned to speak. Nights were ugly: ramen, blue light, and debugging sessions where the only applause was a green checkmark on a CI pipeline. Days were thrilling. First customers, then a round of funding that felt like permission to breathe, then hiring people who actually showed up when they said they would. Alex, my husband, stayed beside me through the chaos, bringing me burnt coffee and the kind of bad puns that made me laugh until my face hurt. He liked to joke that our code base was the only family that didn't ghost us. The company grew in ways I hadn't trusted the spreadsheet to predict. We crossed milestones, then ceilings, then expectations. The kind of success that lets you move from making rent to planning a future is subtle and then sudden. Payrolls, acquisitions, the bewildering moment when you realize you can actually give your parents gifts without asking twice. I didn't broadcast any of it. I was private about money because privacy felt safer than the spotlight my parents seemed to crave. But I did have a dumb little splurge one summer: a Porsche. Not because cars fix whatever the past did to you, but because sometimes you deserve a ridiculous, perfectly balanced indulgence. I posted a single photo of the key on my phone, captioned it with something flippant about midlife crisis, but successful, and then went back to work. Within 48 hours, my phone vibrated like it was trying to start a small earthquake. Texts, missed calls, long Instagram messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. "Congrats!" from Helen at first, a couple of heart emojis, then a suspiciously timed "we need to talk." Greg called but didn't leave a voicemail. Mason slid into my DMs asking for help. "Hey sis, big favor, real emergency." The timing smelled. I screenshotted the messages and showed Alex. He took one look and said, "You love them, but they love what you can do for them." They told a story about sudden hardship. Mason had blown through a small inheritance in a fashion consistent with Mason's talents. The house needed repairs, bills were mounting. Helen painted it with rapid, breathless sentences designed to make me panic. Health scares, uncorroborated, missed paychecks, vague, and the classic family line, "We just don't know where to turn." The subtext was clear. My success was now their bank account if I leaned on it. Nobody asked me how I felt about any of this. Nobody remembered the dentist appointments I'd taken, the nights I sat in emergency rooms while they were busy, the graduated shame of being the kid who had to earn her own seat at the table. It was less about the money and more about the audition. Their sudden interest after one photo, one symbol of ostentation, made the calculus obvious. I wasn't a daughter. I was a resource. The anger was a cool, precise thing. I could feel years of being edited down to make Mason look larger coalescing into a response. I typed a message that was all facts and no fever. "I'm glad you reached out. I'm sorry you're struggling, but I'm not your emergency fund." I suggested resources, offered to connect them with legal advice for refinancing, and because Alex rolled his eyes at my saintly instinct, I told them to communicate through email so nothing got lost in the urgency of a call me now panic. They paused, recalculated, and then pivoted to shame. "After everything we did for you." Helen wrote in a message that tried for wounded and landed somewhere between guilt and accusation. It stung because it pretended a history that never existed. I remembered every time I'd been the quiet fixer, every time my efforts had been footnotes. But the sharper sting was something I hadn't expected. A small, fierce satisfaction that the people who'd ignored me for decades now wanted a slice of the life they'd chosen not to nurture. Their interest wasn't love, it was leverage, raw and transactional. I locked my phone, stood up, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like shrinking to make room for someone else's drama. They wanted a family meeting like it was 1998, and asking for money still came with casserole. Helen called it urgent. Greg said nothing over the phone, which is what he did when he wanted the weight of mystery to do his guilt work for him. Mason showed up late, hair doing that same practiced, "I don't care" thing that used to get him applause. I brought a binder because I always bring a binder. Alex brought coffee and the kind of calm that makes other people seem like they forgot to plug themselves in. They started with small talk. The weather, the neighbor's dog, the things people say when they're trying to reach for the soft landing of normalcy before the hard truth lands. Then Helen leaned forward and said quietly, "We're in a tough spot. Mason needs help." It came with all the old efficient framing, the one who needed saving, the crisis that required a hero. And clearly, this hero was me now, because the universe is not subtle. There's a rhythm I know by heart in conversations like that. The performance of helplessness, the offering of debt as intimacy, the expectation that I'd feel honored to be needed. Instead of guilt, I felt the crisp, clean edge of refusal arrive, like a file sliding into place. I set the binder on the table, opened it, and let the court reporter's silence fill the room. "This is not an emergency for me," I said. "This is an emergency you created by refusing to parent equally. You could have held Mason accountable 10 years ago. You chose not to. I'm not bailing out what you cultivated." My voice was steadier than I expected. I credit long nights of code review for that kind of focus. They tried the classic move, "After everything we did for you." It was a line they'd practiced, so well worn it had become a kind of myth in their mouths. I stopped them with an exact memory. Days I'd sat by hospital beds while they were busy. The loans I'd repaid in secret so their pride stayed intact. The graduations their calendar never remembered. I didn't rage. I cataloged. The specifics are a kind of nonfiction that leaves no room for dramatic reinterpretation. Then I flipped the binder to the thing that had nothing to do with them and everything to do with the life I'd built. There, in official-looking pages and crisp print, was the founding charter for the Lumen Scholarship Foundation, my company's name folded into something that wouldn't let entitlement eat it. I explained, calmly and with a small, almost apologetic smile, "I've allocated $16,000 to this foundation. It's an irrevocable endowment. governed by a board that includes independent trustees, a legal structure that prevents family claims, and a mission that funds first-generation students in STEM and vocational training. I donated the money, set the bylaws, and hired outside counsel to make sure it couldn't be redirected. You could see the gears stall in their faces. Mason's mouth opened like there'd been a technical glitch. Greg leaned back, the old defensive posture of a man who thought money equaled leverage. Helen tried pleading again, this time softer, like maybe the words might be different if they said them tenderly enough, but the outcome was the same. The scholarship didn't care about their need. It cared about deservingness and structure and long-term impact. It gave out help with criteria and receipts and the sort of bureaucracy that is kind to strangers and inhospitable to entitlement. "I'm not saying I won't help in other ways," I said. "I'll connect you to a financial counselor. I'll help Mason find a job and a plan. But I will not be your ATM, and I won't let my work turn into a covering of the patterns you cultivated." The clever, quiet revenge wasn't a slap or a public humiliation. It was redirection. The money that could have rescued the habit of expecting handouts was instead locked into changing lives that actually wanted to be changed. Mason sputtered. There was indignation, humiliation, the kind of rage reserved for people who discover the script has moved on without them. Helen tried to turn apology into negotiation. Greg cleared his throat as if he might cough up a better version of fatherhood on demand. I listened, and for the first time in their drama, I felt neither anger nor the old smallness. I felt like someone who'd finally put the keys in a safe and changed the locks. I sent one short, clean email. No drama, no begging, just a directive. All future communications must go through my attorney. I changed my phone settings so calls from unknown numbers routed to voicemail, and I archived a folder labeled Family that I only opened with a specific, measured purpose: to keep receipts, dates, and the odd photo that proved presence or absence. The binder that used to hold other people's justifications now held contracts, a notary stamp, and a lender's contact list. Tools, not emotional landmines. Boundaries felt boring and terrifying in equal measure, like installing a firewall around your childhood. They tried the old playbook, public melodrama this time. Helen posted a long, breathless message with the kind of punctuation that signals theatrical collapse. Mason did a live rant that oscillated between wounded and entitled, like someone tuning a broken radio. Greg tried an op-ed in the local paper about family values that read suspiciously like a list of conveniences he'd expected. Their social media feeds filled with performative sorrow and selective memory. A cousin I hadn't spoken to since middle school left a comment about what happened to our close-knit family, and it hit like a tiny, absurd percussion instrument in the cacophony. Instead of gaslighting me, their public stunt became evidence. People I'd helped, former classmates, mentees from Lumenly, and alumni of the scholarship pilots, started replying with timestamps and photos. Times I'd shown up at bake sales, scholarship presentations, last-minute rides to the airport. One of the first scholarship recipients posted a video testimony about how Courtney's scholarship made night classes possible. And that clip landed like a small, magical truth bomb. The Foundation's board released a short statement outlining governance and the charity's mission. Legal counsel issued a cease and desist to Mason after he tried to monetize his outrage with a merch line. The strings they'd thought would tug public sympathy snapped instead, revealing the patchwork of their entitlement. Community support was the sort that doesn't fit neatly into a hashtag. Neighbors brought over casserole tins. Actual casseroles, not symbolic ones. Former interns organized a fundraiser that sold out in 2 days. And local reporters who'd once ignored me showed up for a ribbon cutting because the story wasn't salacious. It was structurally interesting. A woman who'd been erased by her family built a vehicle for other people to be seen. Donations to the foundation climbed, but more important were the messages. You were there for me when no one else was. They were a record, a chorus that countered the family narrative with data and gratitude. The irony I savored wasn't vindictive. It was tidy. When privilege tried to play the martyr, procedure and transparency turned it into a farce. My attorney's inbox filled with requests routed through proper channels, and the family's attempts at shame dwindled into private apology drafts that never found the send button. The quiet that followed wasn't loneliness. It was a new kind of room with locks I chose, and the sound of people who actually showed up loudly and often. They tried to come back into my life like a season finale guest star, dramatic entrance, a tearful monologue, then waiting for the applause. Helen sent a letter that read like a condensed memoir. Regret tucked between the lines, acknowledgement where denial used to live. Greg called once, with his voice small in a way that used to make me leap to reassure him, and said, "We were wrong, Courtney." Mason sent a text, "I screwed up. I'm getting help." I accepted parts of that. I don't keep score like a courtroom stenographer anymore, but I do keep records, and I know the difference between an apology that wants to repair and one that wants to buy back a role. So when they asked to meet, I met them on my terms. It was a coffee shop with a neutral table and a lunch hour. Alex walked in and sat at the far end like an experienced bodyguard who makes terrible jokes to steady the mood. Helen cried, quiet, honest tears, and said, plainly, the things she'd never said when they mattered. She had favored Mason because she was afraid of losing him. She had minimized me to keep the family narrative tidy, and she'd been ashamed of that. Greg admitted his silence had been cowardice disguised as stoicism. They did not get everything. I didn't change the foundation bylaws. I didn't unlock the endowment. I did, however, offer them a place on the margins, visits that were scheduled, boundaries that were enforced, and transparency that meant truces were functional, not fawning. For Mason, the path was rockier. He showed up to a job workshop the foundation funded as part of our vocational scholarships. He listened, he took notes, and for once his entitlement met something immovable: structure. That structure didn't pamper him. It taught him payroll systems and how to show up on time. He didn't become the person they'd always imagined would redeem him overnight, but he started. And starting looked better than the old cycles. The real closure came not from their apologies, but from what I chose to build instead. The Lumen Scholarship didn't just become a plaque in my parents' living room or a sidebar item in gossip columns. It became a thing that moved. Students who'd been told no one invested in them stood on stages with shaky hands and diplomas that smelled like new paper and possibility. A mechanic who'd been working nights with 2 kids in community college got certification and a job that paid benefits. A woman who'd been the first in her family to consider STEM sent me a photo the night she coded her first working prototype. The look on her face was a kind of sunrise. Those faces replaced the hollow validation I'd once craved. There is a practical dignity to legacy. It's not spectacle. It's receipts and impact reports. It's mentorship lunches and stubborn program audits. I started hosting a yearly dinner for scholarship alumni. The food was good, the speeches were real, and the laughter was the kind that sticks to your ribs. Alex and I planted a small garden beside the foundation office, because if you want something to outlast you, plant it and tend it. And I named the first rose bed for the students who taught me how small gestures become ecosystems. People ask, rarely, and usually in the context of folklore, whether revenge ever really feels as good as it looks in stories. This felt cleaner and stranger. Not revenge as spectacle, but revenge as reframe. I took what could have been another season of being overlooked and turned it into an institution that looks after people who were never supposed to be seen. My parents' apology arrived like a slow thaw. I accepted it without dismantling the walls I'd built to keep the past from repeating. Mason learned that free is not a sustainable life plan, and, more importantly, that accountability makes you less interesting to manipulate. In the end, the score I keep now is in lives changed, not grudges tallied. I have a husband who jokes about our retirement plan being very online, friends who remember my birthday without a hint of calculation, mentors who send not pity but tough love, and a foundation that pays out tuition checks while my parents finally seeing the difference between being loved and being used. Learn to show up differently. The emptiness my parents left at my wedding didn't close like a wound. It redirected. It carved a corridor that led me to people who would stand in my pews when it mattered. and to a legacy that, unlike their attention, can't be rewired by a single Instagram post.